Money is the root of all discomfort. And when people are afraid to have conversations about it, it breaks apart families, and we get, as a culture, we tend to get really squeamish because it's this thing that we put first in almost all of our lives, but we then are afraid to talk about it at the same time. What a strange paradox. I think the money is not going to solve all of our problems, but money does solve our money problems, right? Or at least we think that it will, right? Quite often, most of those problems are self-inflicted problems, right? We've created huge amounts of debt. I had about $500,000 worth of debt at my apex, or my nadir, I guess it was. Like, at this time in my life where it was like, I have to keep accumulating, and oh, it'll all work out someday, right? I aspired to be like certain people who were figureheads at the corporation at which I worked, and I knew that like if I just worked really hard for 15 or 20 more years, I could be in their positions. But as I got closer to them, what I realized is if I work really hard for the next 15 or 20 years, I'll be just as miserable as them. I'll have just as much debt. I'll have just as much stress and anxiety and discontent. And most of that came from the money problem. So I knew rich people who had money problems. I grew up poor, and growing up poor, we had money problems. And I realized that, wait a minute, it's possible to be financially secure on both sides of the spectrum. Now, if you're below the poverty line, that's much more difficult, and I've experienced that. But the thing that really opened me up to the idea of the responsible stewardship of money is the fact that I realized, like, wait a minute, like, it's one of the few things that I'm in control of. Not the money itself, but deciding what is enough in my life. And so maybe another way to talk about minimalism or simplicity or whatever you want to call it is talk about the art of having enough. And we're no longer constantly desiring excess. We can realize that, wow, some of these money problems that I had, they shouldn't have been problems at all. I created them myself. And along the way, when we heap debt upon more debt upon more debt, we get a little bit of a high, this dopamine rush, but that dopamine rush doesn't last far past the checkout line. And so by the time you get home and you're using the item that you've purchased or the new car, whatever it might be, it feels good for a moment. But then you get that first credit card statement or that first bill in the mail, and you realize, like, wow, this isn't what I thought I signed up for, but this is actually what I signed up for.
For me, one of the biggest reasons I got into minimalism, it was to reclaim my financial independence, meaning I wanted to get rid of as much debt as possible, because that debt, it was making me work 60, 70, sometimes 80 hours a week. And I knew that if I could get that debt down, I could, in turn reclaim some of my time. So what I have learned through this whole process of minimalism is that, money is a renewable resource. Our time is not a renewable resource. So when it comes to my spending, when it comes to debt especially, I look at that as my time. I am giving my time up for some exchange with currency. Now, my secret really is I spend less than what I make. And I know that that's a really simple equation, but it was an equation that I was not aware of and that I wasn't shooting for until I was drowning in debt. There's not this magic number I could say, like, oh, well, this is the perfect amount of money that someone needs to live a happy, meaningful life. But what I do know is the amount of debt that someone needs to live a happy, meaningful life is zero. So that is where minimalism has brought me. When it comes to, like I live in Los Angeles right now. I rent, but I don't have any debt. It's not cheap living in Los Angeles. But the beautiful thing about my lifestyle is that, let's say the rug was pulled out from underneath of me and somehow I had to start from ground zero. I've got a little bit of a safety net that will get me by for 6 months. I certainly have been planning for retirement, so I've got some saved away there for when I turned 65 years old. But what I'm able to do now is I can turn my life around on a dime because I don't owe anyone anything. So let's say tomorrow, all of our books spontaneously combusted and the internet blew up and we were not able to do this for our living anymore. We weren't able to share our story and be the minimalists and somehow create an income off of this. I could still go be a barista and live a meaningful life. Now, I would have to probably move to a different city and most certainly would have to get a different apartment. But because of this thing called minimalism, I'm able to be free. I have no anchors and nothing tying me down.
I think the concept of financial freedom is a strange thing, or financial security is quite often a misnomer in a way. Growing up poor, I knew I didn't want to continue that pattern because I thought that that's the reason we were unhappy. And so as I climbed the corporate ladder throughout my 20s and started making good money and then better money and then even better money, I still wasn't happy, and there was this weird discord there. And what I actually realized is the reason that we were discontented growing up is because we were irresponsible with the few resources that we had. And when you amplified that irresponsibility with more resources, it doesn't automatically make you more responsible and more financially free. It just amplifies the bad decisions you were making before. A bad decision multiplied is simply a worse decision. And so for me, making those same bad decisions, I didn't achieve financial freedom, financial independence. I achieved greater amounts of debt and worry and overwhelm, and my life was out of control. I was letting other people dictate my life because I didn't know what it meant to be responsible with the money that I did have. At the peak of my career, I was making a couple $100,000 a year in the corporate world. And when I walked away from that, the first year I made $23,000. And I was more financially secure that year than I had been the previous decade, because I set my life up in a way to make better choices with the few resources I had.